You are listening to From Embers, a weekly show on CFRC 101.9 FM about anarchist and anti-authoritarian ideas and practice. We are broadcasting from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples on land that has come to be called Kingston, Ontario, Canada, because of the thievery and brutality of the Canadian state and its empire-loving parents. From Embers is about fires, some real and some metaphorical. Fires started generations ago and tended to over the years. Little sparks all across this territory that we hope will grow, spread, and engulf the thieving state called Canada and the capitalist system that has plagued this land since the fur trade. Probably a lot of people hearing this are listening to me online, but From Embers always airs first on CFRC 101.9 FM, my local community radio station here in Kingston, Ontario. We record every episode in the basement of a university building on aging equipment that belongs to this actually very cool little radio station that has been broadcasting here in Kingston since 1922. That's a really long time. Think about the ridiculous technological shifts that have happened since 1922, and this station has been continuously broadcasting through all of those shifts. Obviously, none of the equipment that I'm using right now is from 1922, although I do suspect some of it has been here for several decades, probably since before there was a computer in this little room, and it's all still going strong. Impressive. I really love this radio station. Community radio is a platform for all sorts of weird and wonderful voices that would never make it onto corporate or public radio. I get that the internet is in some ways also that, and yet somehow I don't love the internet nearly as much as I love community radio. I love to turn on the radio station when I'm driving in my car and force myself to listen to 20 to 30 minutes of something that I would never ever have otherwise listened to. We're so used to on-demand everything in 2019, and I absolutely use on-demand all the time. I definitely do not miss cable television, but imagine if cable television was free, volunteer-run, full of alternative, radical, and downright strange hosts and content, and didn't involve any screen time at all. I think on-demand content also allows us to stay in our own ideas bubble, rather than hearing or seeing things that might be new or challenging to us. I've heard lots of stuff on the radio that I wouldn't have bothered clicking on an article about, but I still actually got something out of it once I heard it. I also really like hanging out at the radio station, chatting with people who definitely are not anarchists, but also aren't necessarily like regular people either. There's a lot of content around here that wouldn't be on, network television, because there's a lot of people here who think differently, who are, interested in doing something somewhat alternative, either artistically or politically. In Ontario right now, the Conservative government has passed a law that I'm not going to bother going into that's going to radically change the way organizations like this radio station get their funding. I'm not a student here, and I don't vote in provincial elections either, but because of this funding situation, I've been thinking a lot more generally about how I relate to community institutions that I like, but that are not like anarchist institutions that I think of myself as like having ownership over. It's so easy to be super critical of spaces like this, complain about how they don't function how I'd like them to, or how they're not as radical as they could be, and not appreciate them and support them like I could. there are other spaces and institutions like this here in Kingston that I can think of that I have seen die. And when I knew they were dying, my attitude was kind of like, oh, you know, that's someone else's problem, or like, I'm not going to step up and try to get involved with that, or maybe it'll be sad if it's gone, but it's just not my priority. But honestly, I really miss those places. And maybe there are things I could have done to help them keep going, even if they weren't like the perfect project that I really, really felt like doing right in that moment. I've met a lot of friends and comrades in places that weren't explicitly anarchist spaces, probably more than I've met in explicitly anarchist spaces. And I'd be really isolated if it weren't for grassroots community places like this radio station, especially because I live in a small town where there aren't a lot of explicitly anarchist spaces anyway. If the station dies because students stop paying for it and nobody else in town steps up to fill that gap, I'm going to be really mad at myself for not getting more involved, not doing something, not trying to keep it alive. I guess I've just been thinking about CFRC and how I like it and how I want it to stay alive, and also about like other community institutions that I might feel that way about if I thought they were threatened but don't really think of that way right now. Sort of building a map in my mind of like what are the places here in Kingston that I am grateful for, that I relate to, that I'm glad exist, even if they're not like my space, my home. This week I'm sharing an interview with Byron, who hosts a radio show, not a podcast, on CFRU radio in Guelph, Ontario. We talked a lot about the radio and why we like it, and also about Byron's show in particular, which is called To Know the Land. I think this is a great example of the kind of thing you could hear on community radio that you might not click on online and that wouldn't get airtime on corporate radio that is really, really important. I love that random people in Guelph might just hear this show by mistake, who wouldn't think that they need to hear it, wouldn't bother clicking on it if they saw it on their Facebook feed. I love that it's not just nature enthusiasts and anti-colonial activists who can listen to Byron's show, and also that it's hopefully not just anarchists and anti-authoritarians who listen to mine, although I'm never sure how many people are actually out there listening at this time of night on CFRC. I also learned a lot of things listening to episodes of Byron's show getting ready for this episode, so hopefully some of you will click over to his archives and check it out as well. I think there's really something for everyone to get from this show about the natural world. If you're listening to this on the radio, I hope that hearing Byron's enthusiasm for his show will encourage you to support CFRC here in Kingston. And if you're listening on the internet, maybe it will encourage you to take stock of the spaces and institutions that you're grateful for in your own place or context. I also hope you'll learn some cool stuff about the land, plants, and animals from listening to Byron speak. Here's that interview with Byron. I've also got some great ambient music that he suggested for the show, as well as a few clips from To Know the Land.
My name is Byron. I live in Guelph, Ontario, traditional territory of a very confusing history. It's a lot of people have claimed this space, and a lot of people have argued about those claims. And so now I generally don't, but it is known as Treaty Territory for the Mississaugas of the New Credit, Treaty 3. And I am situated right now in the building, the UC building of the University Center at the University of Guelph campus. And, I work as an educator. I'm a teacher at the Guelph Outdoor School, and I also have a radio show here called To Know the Land, which is about people's connections to the land base, how they learn about the land, how they interact with the land, and their general feels and thoughts about the land.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things I could have interviewed you about, but I did want to talk to you about radio in particular for the most part tonight. Can you tell me a bit about your show and what it's about?
Again, it's called To Know the Land. If just a plug, you can check it out, toknowtheland.tumblr.com. I get to interview lots of different folks lately it's been a lot more authors and writers, but sometimes it's interviewing creative folks, about friends, doing a wide gamut of people's relationships with the land base. I'm especially curious about decolonization and how maybe European descended, white and cultured settlers interact with the land base, and how can we do that in a better way than our ancestors have, and how do we do that in a better way than the culture does, and how can we work towards changing, overthrowing, dismantling the culture so that we have an intact land base that's celebrated and restored, tended, and mended.
And what made you want to start To Know the Land?
Oh, God. There was an organization out of Hamilton, a small collective called Knowing the Land is Resistance. And when they started, their goal was, and I'm going to paraphrase here, and I'm sorry to whomever was a part of this collective, but their goal appeared to me to be that in a colonized culture, we have no concept of the land. We have no relationship, no connection to it. And because we have no connection, no relationship to the land, it's easier for us and the culture to exploit it, to kill the people off who do have real connection, to vilify and other that connection. And when I learned about that, when I started thinking about that more deeply, it touched a nerve that was already swollen and growing and throbbing inside me of a deep desire for profound connection and profound. When we talk about anarchism, we talk about affinity. We talk about people's connection to each other over shared values. And if there is something that I have deep and profound affinity with over anything else in life, it's the land base. And I wanted to know more about it. I wanted to really understand it. I describe it sometimes that I want to see it like Neo does in The Matrix. I want to see all the different connections. And so I get very enthused about it, and I just wanted to know more.
Yeah, I mean, I spent a little while today listening to a bunch of your archives in preparation for this interview. And you're such a wealth of knowledge. Like, you have so many different ideas and pieces of information that I definitely didn't know. You know lots of things about species of bird that I didn't even know existed that probably fly around me all the time. Is that you? Do you think of yourself as kind of a teacher, or are you looking at that up on Wikipedia on your way over to the station? Are you learning with your listeners, or are you teaching listeners about things that you just happen to know?
Both, always. So I'm always learning. Every day I'm learning so much all the time, and I can share what I'm learning and ask questions of what I'm learning. And then I'm also sharing what I have learned. There's been a lot of growth. I couldn't even describe how much growth it's been over the past many years of learning about the land, learning in a community, learning at the school where I teach about connection with the land base, or about naturalist ideas, or about just folks' relationships. And luckily, the show has been able to teach me more, because I get to talk to authors, I get to talk to researchers, I get to talk to friends who know a lot. So I'm learning more, and it's just all coming in all ways. So I am learning all the time, but I'm also teaching with what I'm learning about. And I learn from the kids at the school, and I just learned today, okay, I'm so stoked. I just learned today that if a hornet comes in, or a wasp comes into a bee's nest, the bees will surround the wasp, and they will fan the wasp with the heat from their bodies, with their wings, and they'll do that until the wasp overheats and dies. And I just learned that from a kid today, a 7-year-old kid, and it blew my mind. And so I'm always learning, and I'm always stoked, and it's ongoing all the time.
Can you, just for my listeners who didn't spend hours in your archive already today, can you give some examples of the kinds of content that you've covered on To Know the Land? What are some of your favorite episodes to date?
Oh man, I've been thinking a lot about an interview I did with Queer Nature I'm not sure if you've heard that one, but Queer Nature is Pinar and So, and I think they have some other folks that help them out. And they do a lot of the same work that I do of working with people, learning about ancestral skills, fire making, tracking, learning about animals in the land base. But also they do it from a perspective that embraces queerness and understands that as a pivot point, as a place of positioning yourself in the world, but also as a place of positioning yourself on the land. And the things that they had to say were like, again, these things that maybe me and my co-host felt, and then it was just like, yes, you're saying exactly what we feel, and we really understand this. And it was a really great way to connect with folks through that, and meet other people who've listened to the show, but like, that's what I'm into. Thank you for broadcasting that one. I got to talk to Janet Kyle, who is a retired, or not retired yet, a teacher from Toronto who moved up towards Peterborough. And then when she was up there, she purchased 91 acres. And then in her relationship with the land base, she's really saw how colonialism works and how relationships that European descended folks have with the land have taken the land away from Indigenous people. And then because of learning that through her connection with the land base, she's working now with Alderville First Nations to give the 91 acres back. She's taking the 91 acres that she just got and working for a long-term plan to give the land back. And talking to her was amazing, and just someone with such insight, humility, and patience, and respect for the Indigenous people around, and like realizing that she doesn't know much, but she's working with them to learn how to do this. That was really awesome. And then from a purely, like, I love this author, Mark L. Brock, and I have a ton of his books. He's a really good biologist, amazing tracker, and I use his books a lot, and his new book came out, and I got to interview him the other day about his new book about animal tracking. So that was even fun. That was a fun one too.
Yeah, that does sound really awesome. What do you personally enjoy about doing this radio show in particular? Like, what do you like best about it? Purely for your own pleasure.
Oh, man. I get to learn so much. My partner would say it's because I'm a Sagittarius that I just always want to learn so much more all the time. More is more. And that's it. I get to come in, and if I learn something at school for the day, I will spend an hour or two before the radio researching it, answering all the questions that I had throughout the day, and then getting to talk about it on air. And then I create an archive of my radio show, but that's also an archive I can go back to and refresh my memory and learn from. I get to, if I'm interested in a topic, I call the researcher up, and because I'm on the radio, they now want to talk to me instead of being some stranger. So they will talk to me about the questions that I have, and I can ask professionals, researchers, folks who've been doing this for a long time, elders who've been learning about these things, and they will answer my questions freely, and I can promote the work that they're doing, and I can just share this knowledge with a bunch of other people. Having this radio show is a really democratic way, or maybe not even democratic. That sounds weird. I don't like that one. Is a very open source way of sharing with people tremendous knowledge from multiple different angles and lots of different people. It's like a library.
It also sounds great. Did you have experience with radio or audio production at all before you got involved? Like, how did you find out about the radio station and start doing that side of things?
When I was a kid, my friends and I would make weird radio shows on tapes. They're terribly embarrassing to play now, but when we would do it all night, and we'd stay up and make stupid jokes and pretend we were on the radio. And then I started doing ambient music production, and then playing weird folk punk music and recording that for myself, recording friends, doing a lot of soundscapes and field recordings. And then meeting people who were doing radio stuff, getting to help out once in a while. And then George Rocket, who lives out east now, when visiting Halifax, we would go to CKDU and take over the radio station from midnight to 8 in the morning and do an 8-hour fill-in. And we just had so much fun doing those. We would invite people to come on air in the morning at 5 o'clock, and then 6 o'clock, and then 7 o'clock. We would play Power Violence on the hour every hour, so that when people's alarm clocks went off, it would just be Power Violence. And I had so much fun doing that and getting the chance to really work on the radio a lot that I came to Guelph and I was like, I have to do this. I have to get a radio show. So I've been doing them in different forms for a couple of years, but this iteration, this show, has been the longest running.
And how long have you been doing it?
Since early 2017, so it's not even that long. But it's been great, and not every week. Often Mondays are holidays, and if I don't go to work, I don't go to the radio often.
I like that. I like that ethic, yeah.
Hey folks, you're listening to Know the Land on 93.3 FM, broadcasting from the University of Guelph. The show is about people's connections to land base, how they interact with the land, how they learn about the land, what inspires them about the land base. My name is Byron. You can check out the website toknowtheland.tumblr.com. Today we're talking to Andrew Tasselmeyer about ambient music, not just ambient music, also field recordings project, also connected to Robert McFarlane's book Landmarks, which I've talked about on the show before, and we'll just get right into it. Thank you for being on the show. I'm really stoked. I learned about you and your existence because on the trail by the river where I live, I was walking with my roommate Dave, and we were just walking and talking, and up against a tree, I don't even remember what kind of tree it was. It might have been a buckthorn. There was a trail cam, maybe. Do you remember how high it was?
It was about eye level on my height, so I'd say about 5 feet.
Yeah,
over the ground.
I was going to say that too. 5 feet and a little bit set back from the river, and I got so excited that somebody's looking at the river because I go down to the river and I sit there every day just looking at things or tracking. And there was an email tag on the side, and I guess that was your professor.
Mm-hmm.
And I emailed your professor to find out about the project, and then they forwarded the email to you.
That's
and
it.
You responded.
I did, 3 weeks late because of exams.
I am thankful. I am thankful that you took the time, even 3 weeks late, to respond, and I'm very curious, especially about the river there. I'm so curious. Can you tell us about the project? And do you want to tell us, tell all the listeners what you got up to today?
Yeah, so a group of about 50 plus people showed up at the Trans-Canada facility here in Hamilton and got inside the facility and were attempting to shut the space down for the day. And yeah, that's what we were up to.
So for me, that sounds great. For some listeners, that probably sounds really cool. What is Trans-Canada? I was tracking coyotes the other day and came across a cow carcass, and sitting on the snow that was covering up the skull was one of these little bugs, like a mosquito, but maybe a little bit bigger. It was really pretty, and really nice to see that there's like little flying insects around in the winter. You know, I don't remember its name because I'm still learning about them, and that's what this show is all about. It's about learning about the land base.
Today's show, we're going to be talking about a beautiful, beautiful wildflower that I see everywhere right now, growing along the roadsides. It's Sicorium intybus, or chicory, common chicory, the wild cousin of the domestic endive. And we'll get into that and talk about some of the associates, like who hangs out with chicory, maybe other plants, what insects interact with chicory, and then talk about some of the more thorough description of the plant. And then, actually, maybe I'll start with a thorough description of the plant, and then I get into maybe like human interaction with the plant, how we've used it and how we've associated with it. I like thinking of that wait, what's the word? I can't even remember what the word is. It's ecological functions first before the human relationship, because I think that's primarily why the plant is there. It doesn't need us, but it does need its surrounding environment.
You are listening to From Embers on CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, or you might be listening to the podcast edition of From Embers Online. This week we are talking about community radio and also about knowing the land with Byron, anarchist, artist, radio host in Guelph, Ontario. Byron hosts a show called To Know the Land, and I got in touch with him this week because I wanted to talk about our radio stations and our shows and why we like broadcasting on this now kind of seemingly old-fashioned technology that is actual broadcast radio. I just played a few clips from the show in case people wanted to know more about what it was about. You can also check out the show if you want to. You just have to go to the website of CFRU Radio in Guelph and look through their archives. They have a really handy thing where if you look at their program schedule, you click on Byron's show, which is called To Know the Land, you'll actually see all of his archived shows in one place. And that is a great way to find his past content. You could also tune in. You could tune in on the airwaves if you happen to be in Guelph, Ontario, or you could tune in online live on Mondays from 6 to 7 p.m. by going to cfru.ca and just clicking the little play button at the top right corner if you want that experience of live radio, but you don't happen to be in Guelph. Here's the rest of my interview with Byron. I'll probably play some songs later on too. Thanks a lot for listening to From Embers. So you're making it sound like it's all like amazing and perfect and floaty and like radio is like paradise. What's the most annoying thing about doing a weekly show?
Sometimes I'm tired after work. I work outdoors with kids in all sorts of weather all year long. So it might be minus 40 all day and we couldn't get the fire going and we're cold or we're just tired. It takes a lot out of you. And then I have to walk up to campus, which is pretty far from where I work. Not too far, but far in the middle of winter. And then I have to go sit and talk. And often I don't pack a lunch beyond my lunch. So even today, the last time I ate was noon. And I'm usually hungry. I'm hangry and pretty tuckered out. So it's difficult, but that's why it's nice to have archives and it's nice to have pre-recorded shows that are ready to just fill in. Yeah.
Do you have co-hosts or do you do the show on your own?
Sometimes I have co-hosts. My pal Danielle comes and helps me with the show sometimes. I've had other folks on. What I always put out to friends is if there's someone that they want to interview, but they don't know how to go about doing it, I would be there to help run the boards, do the interview with them, and come up with questions and just do the whole process so we can share that interview. And so when that happens, which doesn't happen very often, I love it to happen more. It's probably only happened like 5 times since 2017, but that's when I have co-hosts.
And how do you come up with enough content to do a weekly show all by yourself? I personally, like, there are 3 of us here, and we don't even do a full 4 shows a month. We usually syndicate something at least once. I can't imagine trying to come up with something to say that's new and interesting every 7 days. How do you make that happen?
So I've got the best focus on Earth. I've got the entire universe that I can talk about. Literally, I can talk about everything that exists, that's always existed, that's existed before, that's extinct. Right now, I'm researching glaciation and what happened after the glaciers left. So I could be talking about that on the air, or I can talk about projected futures. What is climate change looking like? How do we interact with that? I can talk about plants, animals, bugs, birds, just weather, whatever I want. And luckily, my content, my source content, is the entirety, is all that there is. So when I talk about knowing the land, there is so much on this planet to learn about that I know nothing about. So I can always be learning about things, and then do tangents and interview people who are really doing neat stuff. And I mean, there's so much out there. Like Estrevan Lupino Smith, who lives out west, used to live in Ontario, had some hardcore bands for a while, is working on similar like education pieces about teaching people about the land through artwork and research, and also tying in queer theory and how do we queer our relationships with the land base. And that like, I can't think of that stuff on my own, but I get to talk to people about it. And so I get to talk to people about all sorts of weird, divergent things. And I've always new things to learn about. And yeah, I don't think I could ever run out of content. Sometimes I feel a little bit stuck, but then I can easily revisit something that I've already learned a bit about and try and learn more. And if I don't have an idea for a show, sometimes I don't have an idea for a show, but I go to work. And today we were looking at a dead mink all day. And so I can go research the mink and then come to work and do a show. So there's all sorts of ideas all the time.
Do you have any sense if anybody out there is listening to the show? Do you ever get any feedback?
I've asked people if they could email, and it happens once in a while. But not very often. I did just have a long series of exchanges with a photographer from Oregon who is looking to download episodes of the show so that he can listen when he's out in sort of areas that don't have internet access, and he can just play them in his off hours. And it seems like there's folks for the recent Mark Elbrock interview. Mark Elbrock's fairly well known. And some of the researchers that I do get to research or I get to talk to are fairly well known. So people want to hear content related to them. The show that's actually broadcasting right now, while we're talking, my radio show is on. And I'm talking to someone who put out an album based on Robert McFarlane's book Landmarks. And that book is very popular. The album is international. So I feel like when I send out the archives or the archived link to that person, that show will get a lot of play around the world. So that it's pretty neat that sometimes there are listeners who are actually listening, but it's hard to measure for the actual broadcast within Guelph. Sometimes I have folks come up and say, "Oh, I listen to your show. I know your voice." And so, but it doesn't happen very often.
And assuming that lots of people in Guelph are listening, maybe like just tuning in by accident in their cars, or maybe on purpose, just they know about that show to know the land and they turn it on. What is the point? What do you hope people will get out of the show? What are the take-home messages that you're hoping people will come away with?
I want them to fall in love with the land. I want them to know the land a little bit more, to really appreciate that mystery, awe, and wonder, and to go out there and explore and know that place, and to teach people that they care about, so that we can create a crew of folks who actually care about the land so much, more than a crew, or maybe like a population of folks that care about the land so much that it becomes important to them and that they'd be willing to defend it. That's it.
Do you think that a radio show is a good way to invoke that for people?
I think it's part of a multi-pronged approach. I think that some people listen to the radio who may not go to certain websites, who may not read certain books, who may not have access to certain ideas or ways of being with the world. But the radio is very cheap, very easy, and then online content is becoming cheaper and easier for folks to appreciate as well. So it feels like a very simple way that it can reach many people, and very easy on my part too. There's no printing costs. There's no, I don't pay very much for the broadcasting costs yet, but that might come up. But for now, it's a very simple and cheap way for folks to learn about ideas. And you do it by accident. Like you said, people just turn on the radio as they're driving home. My show airs from 6 to 7, so a lot of people are in the car then, or maybe they're preparing dinner and they just throw on the radio.
And what do you hope will change if more people get to know more about the land they inhabit and fall in love with it and feel that sense of wonder that you're kind of talking about?
Oh, I got utopian visions coming out of my butt. I would hope that people, they appreciate the land. They don't let folks destroy it. They stand up for it. They fight for it. They defend it. And not only do they defend it, they mend it. They fix the damage that's been done. They change the ways that they think about the land, and maybe drop some of the colonial mentalities and explore and start learning about pre-colonial mentalities, maybe like their ancestral connections to the land base, other ancestral connections to the land base. How do other cultures set an example for what we can learn and how we can interact with the land better? Because we have a long way to go on that. And not to say that my show is going to do all that, but maybe it touches somebody and gives a perspective that they've never heard before, or one that just hits them at the right time or something.
If your community radio station didn't exist, do you think there are other ways you could put out these ideas, like in an audio format?
I used to make a lot of audio zines, and it would just be a CD with some liner notes. And I would hand these out, or I'd sell them at shows. And I think that is one way, but it's a step away from accessible. Whereas the radio, it's already there. The infrastructure is all there. All you have to do is really just flip a switch and turn a knob, and you're on. I could make a podcast, but honestly, I don't have all the infrastructure in place on my own to do that, where it's good to have an organization, a group of folks who are all working together to support each other to create content, and then create an infrastructure that can support the content that we're creating. And that feels really nice, and it's a lot simpler. I could be making zines, and I do make zines still to share the ideas that I have, or that I'm researching, or that I'm learning about. And those authors that I interview, they make their books, but it's still very costly for a lot of those resources. And I don't have the money for it all. And many of my friends or the folks I know don't have the money for those things. So I have a central spot where people are working together, sharing the resources, sharing the tools, sharing the space to help us create and produce and broadcast content. Makes it a lot easier than anything I could probably do on my own.
Do you meet other like-minded people hanging out at CFRU? Like, do you hang around the station? Do you feel like there's a community there?
There's totally a community here. When I got here, there was someone I haven't seen all summer because they've been away working. It was nice to see them. As I was walking the hall, someone dragged me into the studio, said, we have to do an interview, because we were trying to do an interview for a long time, but they didn't have anybody that week, and they just saw me here, so we just did an interview. And they're cool folks. They're working on neat projects within the framework of the university, which is not a framework I really engage with outside of a few events or a few organizations here. But they're pretty cool. And I feel like a lot of the folks within the radio station have shared values on access to resources and access to the ability to broadcast. The ability to have your voice heard is very limited for folks who don't have the capital to do it. So having a space like this allows a lot more people to do it, and then it sort of draws out certain individuals who value that idea, and often we find other commonalities around shared spaces like this.
I think a lot of people sort of think that radio specifically, like broadcast radio, is kind of obsolete or on its way there because of the internet, because there's so much information already available to us. And especially, I mean, in the case of specifically radio, I guess, because of podcasting as a new format. What would you say to those people? Like, why is it worth still transmitting it? Why is it worth still putting it actually out on a frequency?
So I was reading a news report the other day from Hong Kong, and folks were up in arms because the state there turned off the internet. They just shut it down. Nobody could access the internet. Folks had problems communicating. Information couldn't be shared. Information that could keep people safe could not be shared. And my first thought was, why don't they use the radio? You know, you can't turn off the radio. You can jam it, but it's a lot of work. And for institutions that are trying to stay ahead of the game, sometimes obsolete or low-tech technologies, which people can create in their own homes, it takes a little bit of learning and it takes a little bit of resources, but which people can create, can be great ways to share information and do it in a way that doesn't require a lot of capital input to receive the information. Folks in Hong Kong were talking about they were getting online through their cell phones. You don't need a cell phone to get on the radio. You can get on on the radio with your cell phone. You can tune in, but you don't need it. All you need is some very cheap equipment, maybe just a radio, or like a alarm clock, or most places have a stereo, and most stereos still have tuners that you can just tune in on. It's pretty open, and I feel like when we talk about it in maybe a more theoretical sense, it feels much less mediated for me, but I'm also a fan of radio, so maybe that's it. But I feel much less mediated communication forms are possible through the radio than through the internet or through other ways of broadcasting.
Yeah, I mean, especially live radio. Like, if you're there in studio saying something controversial, I could just call you up and be like, hey, man, like, that doesn't make any sense. You're wrong. I think in many ways there's a quality to it that's like more candid and less mediated for sure than a lot of the online news media that we get. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess like right now, because of like the Ford government and lots of things that are going on campuses with like funding for these radio stations, there actually are people who are like, it seems like pretty actively trying to destroy campus community radio. I don't think they'll do it. Like, I think people do support their stations, at least here. I feel like many people do. But in theory, if such people succeeded, what do you think we would lose if we let campus community radio stations die? Like, what would we miss if we let them go?
Just imagine what you'd have to listen to on the radio if there was no campus community radio. Just imagine what we'd have to, the only large sources of communication in local, on a local scale was the crummy New Country station. I'm a fan of some of those New Country songs, but I'm not a fan of how they're delivered on corporate radio. I'm not a fan of the ads. I'm not a fan of the lifestyle projection that announcers are paid to reinforce. I'm not a fan of just that whole culture. And I think that when we have, it's a monoculture. It's what's wrong with a lot of the ways that we approach the land base too. We just clear out diversity, plant one thing, and do whatever we can to suppress and kill anything else that diverges from it. On our show, we have so many different broadcasters broadcasting of so many different topics in so many different languages that it allows a much more diverse space to grow. It is a forest of knowledge and a forest of music. It is diverse and varied and shifting and changing, and it's growing and dissolving on its own. And I think that if we cut funding, a shared volunteered funding, where folks have made the decision a while ago and then instituted it in the infrastructure of their universities, that they made this choice that they want to support these organizations. If the government comes in and says you cannot, we're changing the way that you've chosen. If the state comes in and tells students, you can't do this, you're not allowed to, we're taking away the things that you wanted, then it limits what the students can do, how they can do it, what knowledge they can attain, what broad perspectives they may have for favor of those larger corporate voices, those larger corporate entities. And we all know, or I'm going to assume that a lot of listeners probably know what the value systems of those large corporate entities are versus a diversity of common folks and their shared voices and their diverging voices. So that's a big thing. I love that here on this radio station we have a lot of different folks sharing what they know and sharing what they're learning about and sharing what they care about, rather than Bob and Tim down at Seajoy.
Okay, if you were doing this show about you, if you had Byron in studio with you right now, what would you ask you about?
How'd you get so cool? No, I think I would ask me, would you be proud of you in 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years from now, and 10 years from now? Would you be stoked on who you are, who you're becoming, and where you've come from and how far you've gotten? And I think that would be a nice long way for me to look at myself and say, well, yes, no, I can get better. And hopefully I'm on the right course to get better. And hopefully I can do more for what I care about.
How do you choose the music for To Know the Land? I noticed you always have some selections, especially at the end of the show. How does that connect for you, and what kind of tunes do you play?
I usually play ambient music or post-rock kind of stuff or field recordings. And sometimes in earlier shows I'd play a lot more hardcore or punk stuff, but I find that a lot of the ambient music that I listen to is inspired, at least superficially, by folks' connections to the land base. Or it can be good background music to explore ideas or to maybe ingest the ideas that we're talking about. I've also thought of lately recording more of my own music, instrumental music, to play during shows. So I did a interview with Eileen Christ, who wrote the book Abundant Earth Towards an Ecological Civilization. And she's great. She talks about human supremacy and what does that mean and how do we interact with the world without challenging the notions of human supremacy. And you can think of human supremacy as white supremacy, but instead of just whiteness and white enculturation being the dominant voice and view, it's humans and how humans interact with the land base. The human mind, human-centric values are how we interact with the land. And after that, after really doing a lot of research, reading her book for a long time, I felt kind of like mournful. And so I went out and just sat in the backyard with my guitar, and there's birds singing and cicadas doing their thing. And the music just came, and that was really good. And I think sometimes it's helpful for me to be able to play the music that I want to play and then record it and play that on the show, or to have other bands or other things that really inspire me that other folks are making or other folks are working on.
Have you been recording since, I know you used to record music for sure in your more folk punk days. Have you been recording songs yourself that people can access? Can I use them in the show?
Not really.
Yeah.
Not really. I've recorded a few things a while ago, some ambient stuff, some weird sound art things, and then I have a lot online of like old stuff. But what I play now isn't really shared.
Mm-hmm.
It's shared in a context of not recorded. Like I'll sing and play with friends. I sing a lot with the kids at school. We always sing songs, and I'm writing songs that are about stuff like that. Like we just wrote one this summer with the kids, and it's 2 words. It's called Coyote Den, and the words are Coyote Den, and it's a punk song for kids. And we just yell out the words Coyote Den over and over again in a beautiful melody. And that's the kind of thing that I've been doing a lot lately, but it's not recorded. Although we're probably going to record a CD for a fundraiser at the school. But as of my own stuff, no, not really.
Mm-hmm.
Not really anymore.
In that case, do you have a recommendation for like an album that really like makes you think about the themes that come up in your show?
Oh man. So the broadcast that's happening right now for my show is talking to Andrew Tasselmeyer, an ambient musician who also does field recordings. And he's putting together an album, or he put together an album called Place Language. And it's based on or inspired by Robert McFarlane's book, Landmarks. And within the book, Landmarks, there are 9 glossaries. And the glossaries are words from, I think, 32 or 36 different languages across Europe, where words, describing words of the land or natural phenomena that are falling out of use or forgotten or long have not been used or recently taken out of the dictionary because people are finding them obsolete. These words are beautiful, and they describe in such detail how people have noticed phenomena on the land. So Black Wind of the Crow. Black Wind of the Crow would be like a phrase used in Shetland, Scotland, to describe a cold, biting easterly wind. And so folks who are noticing this cold, biting easterly wind had a name for it. They would describe this wind in a very specialized way. And Robert McFarlane's book describes these words and then has longer form chapters that sort of get into these themes as well. And then Andrew Tasselmeyer sent out these words to ambient musicians and field recordists around the world and said, can you make something with this? Can you make some music that's inspired by these words? And that album was put together, and it's beautiful. It's got a lot of different folks from around the world. I don't know everybody. I'm not the biggest music nerd, but you can hear the landscapes in a lot of the songs that they're trying to convey. You can hear the words that they're trying to convey. And it's beautiful. There's Andrew Tasselmeyer, his band Hotel Neon has a track on the album called Rhyme. And Rhyme is like a hoarfrost. And if you can imagine a cold, crispy frost that you see when you come out in the morning that's coating everything, they made an ambient track that's really conveys that and really shares that feeling. And it's a beautiful album altogether, and there's lots of different folks from all over the world, and it's really neat.
That sounds awesome. Thanks so much for the recommendation. That's actually like very like topical and perfect. Is there anything else that you'd like to say that I didn't ask you about?
I would like to encourage folks to just go outside and start learning about things, and just start with your friends, start on your own. There's a magic to going out on your own and just spending time sitting quietly, not walking, not with headphones on, just sitting quietly somewhere and observing. And just observe. And then when a question comes, quickly write it down and then just keep observing. And then take your question book. I have a question book. It's my textbook. And then go research. Go find out what it is. And then go back and tell somebody what you learned. Share that story. And then go back and sit outside again. Just sit quietly and do the same thing. And beautiful things start happening. Beautiful intricacies, the way that you learn about the land, the way you see things on the land really come to the fore. And it's quite an amazing thing. So I think I would just encourage that. And then if you want to know more, you can listen to the show.
Yeah, how can people do that? If people are listening to this and they're like, wow, that guy's really cool, I want to listen to way more of him talk, how do they find your show online?
So for the two of you that think that, you can listen by going to CFRU.ca and finding the show archives. You can go to the program schedule. You click on it, a map of the days will come up, and you can go down Mondays to 6 o'clock and listen to the archives, or Mondays at 6 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. You can go on the website and listen to it live. I also have a website, toknowtheland.tumblr.com, and there's a show archive section where folks can download the shows and listen to previous shows dating back to 2017, and current shows usually available 5 minutes after they've finished airing.
Great. I'll put links in the show notes too, so online listeners can find those directly if they didn't quite hear you. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me. This was awesome.
Yeah, thank you for having me on the show.
All right, thank you.
home of theory and real talk, that radical hip-hop. The beat don't stop till every last cop dropped the badger off a cliff, like I give a fuck.
Wait, hold up. That was 2012 style. It's still fuck the police, but where are we going?
This ain't the motherfucking Chapo frat house. They call me a woke Joe Rogan, the way I bring them facts out. But I don't sit down and break bread with Nazis and break beef to break borders and destitute economies. Out here on a Harlan commune where the cops can't find you and them pine trees calm you. Collective liberation, food autonomy and anarchy. Not an identity, some practices to get free. I do this shit cause I like to read and explore what it means to be a real human being. In the Anthropocene, we stay pushing, expanding imagination, think beyond the quote-unquote revolution. Let's get free in the here and now and recognize the little's work from Napoleon to Mao. Shout out the Zapatistas, Rojava, and those who get it. We can live without the state even if we don't get it. The old world's dying, build a new one instead. While I'm trying to kill that colonized white man living in my head. Moving beyond ideological disputes. Don't tell me what you hate, tell me what you're gonna do. No politician's gonna save you. Bully that. Talk to me about build the party, let's just show me what the weeds at. Think outside the box, there's a million ways to fight back. Learn about a few on the motherfucking Soulcast. The Soulcast, a bi-weekly podcast at the end of every other week. Available on the Channel Zero Podcast Network or wherever podcasts are found.